Okay, so thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be talking as part of the National Core Study. This is a scoping study that we'll discuss, one that was done over the 3 months, beginning of 2021, and one that allowed us to particularly look at the construction industry in order to try and scope for ourselves and work with them to decide what were the key problems related to transmission of COVID in the workplace in that particular environment. We were very fortunate to have access to 4 of the worldwide major construction companies. That's Kia, Multiplex, Costain, and Lend-Lease. They have not only large-scale activities within the UK, but also extend out to various other parts of the world as well. And we were very privileged that they made their health and safety directors available to us, and through them cascaded down into all of their management streams and gave us the sort of information that we needed to try and put together a snapshot of how they reacted to the COVID epidemic. As far as the Thomas Ashton Institute was concerned, Andrew and I are privileged to have a wide range of talent available to us to bring on board for a study like this. The Institute extends across the 3 faculties inside the University of Manchester, but also extends across HSE's Science Division. We have 6 themes, and for each of those themes, there are theme leads that represent both HSE and the university. And so that pool of talent was put together over a series of packages and allowed us to look at not only the health, but also the workplace stress, the type of leadership modes that were adopted, and the engineering aspects that COVID had brought and transmission of the disease had caused adaptations to the sort of processes that the project was operating by. So just a brief overview of how it was organized. We essentially grouped around 5 work packages, but as I present them now, 2 of them are going to be put into one. That's looking at transmission risks, and coupled with that, leadership and good practice in the workplace. We looked at simulation and the use of data and how that could be brought to bear on trying to understand the pandemic. We looked at the sort of technologies that were available, particularly how they were being deployed and used on the construction work sites. And then finally, we had an overview of the project delivery parts of this and how at the top level, this was fed back down through the sector leads and into other agencies as we did so. At all points, we had great collaboration from the construction stakeholders, but also into other areas that have key use for construction in the workplace, particularly through Richard's contacts back into government, and he'll talk about those shortly. So what was the background to the study? Obviously, construction accounts for a significant proportion of the overall UK economy. This means that it was very important for government to continue this, particularly during last summer. And you'll be aware of Project Speed that was launched by the Prime Minister July, I think, wasn't it? Going forward, because of the size of this sector, it's going to be crucial to the post-COVID recovery for UK, and so has a really major role in how the government sees this in the future going forward. So we hope from this study and the follow-on, which we hope to start, to be able to get an idea not only of how COVID has hit the construction sector, but to make the sector more resilient going forward post-pandemic to another bio threat going forwards. So we worked around these different packages. We looked in phase 1 at a whole series of parts to this. trying to use both questionnaires, but also surveys and interviews to get the sort of analysis that would allow us to make some conclusions on how to go forward. HSC helped us by not only delving into the experience of their inspectors, but also looking to how, for instance, construction unions were reacting to the way the pandemic had impacted. The first of the packages that we put into place was led by someone known to this audience and also working on the Protect project. That's Martin van Tongeren. He was trying to look at specific transmission risks in the construction industry. Also around risk mitigation and the measures that have been introduced, and particularly the challenges that the sector has had around both complying with those measures, but also applying them to vulnerable and non-vulnerable components of the workforce. This was combined with another of our leads looking into the leadership and governance requirements. And that covered not only the physical health, but also the mental ill health that workers found through the project. All of our themes started off with literature surveys. I'm not going to go through in detail the list on the slide in front of you, but you can see there that there are a whole series of complex factors that really became clear the more we discussed with the workforce leads. The workplace culture and the socio-economic factors behind the sector were really key in complicating the picture for us. And it was those experiences at home and in transport that were driving the transmission that really dominated the picture going forward as to how the sector saw workplace going forward. So these were the different factors and the findings that Marty's package found. It was the strong safety culture that was really important in being able to allow the sector to respond, at least within the people that we interviewed. There were limited clusters of cases there, and there was a general perception that these weren't linked to actually the work conditions. Behavioral change was key in the mitigation measures. And one of the key factors that came out of this is that the contractual arrangements really drove the way that the sector implemented the changes that they put into place. Major challenges were around the variety of different jobs and tasks that one has in the sector. But as I say, the workplace behavior outside the workshop was something that really was found to make it very difficult for the sector to manage the way forward. The big concerns around this was mental health. That was clearly a key concern, and it was one that was dealt with generally on a case-by-case basis inside the industry. And that successfully handled their individual risks, but again, it's those wider concerns outside the workplace that was seen to be the problem from the point of view of the sector. The leadership was in place, and good practice was seen to be key in helping to manage the risks that they saw. However, it was the contractual agreements that really contributed to the challenges, and that's something that I think Rich will come back to in his discussion later on. We also looked at the controls and technologies, and I'm going to talk about some of those in more detail in a moment. But the main factor that really drove the way forward was around the use of the PPE. And it was PPE that really dominated most of the concerns of the sector and allowed them to control transmission, particularly on sites. The second work package we ran was around technology. The question that was asked was whether technology itself could actually manage to take the human out of the loop to some extent and reduce transmission and allow biosecurity to establish itself. So various technologies were looked at, and assess. A literature survey was done of all of those. But in essence, it was found that actually robotics had very little impact because of there was a considerable cost implication in bringing them on board, and it wasn't one that was being generally used within the workplace at the time the pandemic broke out. Wearables were again seen of use in the future, but again weren't being used in the sector, particularly at the lower tiers in their work on the sites. So the main focus, as with a lot of other parts of the National Core study, has been around PPE simulation, and the sort of analysis of the data coming in was again something that we looked at and was again seen to be useful, but there were aspects of it going forward that the sector would like to see developed. The key findings again showed that there was a traditional approach taken to data collection, i.e. they were monitoring the positive cases, number of people in self-isolation, etc., etc., and obviously the results of the testing that were going on sites. There was limited application, however, of particular simulation and modeling within transmission, although there's obviously lots of modeling that goes on in the background around the sector and the way it works. However, the sector does have very positive attitudes going forward and would like to use these things in the future. And perhaps one of the future follow-ons from this will be to look at how they may take up on some of these tools going forward. And finally, we looked at the project delivery side. And at this point, I'll pass over to Richard, who can hopefully talk to you about this going forward.
Thank you very much, Neil. And just apologies from my end if there's any breakup in the comms. Have some issues with broadband here in West Yorkshire at the moment. So Work Package 5 considered broader construction project delivery issues, particularly in the context of the UK construction sector, which, as you may be aware, entered the pandemic in a particularly challenging environment. And conversations with our participants kind of suggested that the tensions that often exist between participants in a construction contract were still apparent during the pandemic. And this is a consequence essentially of historically low profit margins. In some cases, tier one contractors may be working in minus 0.5% profit margins, and the consequence is that then passes down to tiers 2 and 3 and can lead to behaviours which often place health, safety and welfare at the bottom of the priority list. Cabinet Office issued new guidance in relation to responsible contractual behaviour as a means to help resolve potential disputes that may arise on construction projects. But nevertheless, very little changed in terms of the nature and structure of contracts, despite the transformational impact of the pandemic. So we see the ability to deliver a biosecure sector as being dependent on an industry system that places the welfare of workers at the centre of organisational decision making. But of course, the industry is made up of a workforce which includes a large number of self-employed individuals, and that can make the challenge of creating a safe working culture particularly difficult. We've uncovered evidence, which I think is quite well known through ONS data, that there is a significantly higher level of self-employment in the building sector relative to civils. I think that perhaps reflects the majority of big civil engineering projects being government projects, and therefore there is potentially a greater opportunity for direct employment through the security that government contracts provide. There is ambitions, I think, within BEIS to try and encourage progression towards much greater levels of direct employment and therefore creating stability in the workforce and the benefits that come with that. But that hasn't been specifically articulated in the recently published HM government construction playbook. So we shall have to see how that pans out. And the other important data, I think, is in relation to disputes, which of course are quite common on construction projects, and they can create a real difficult environment, both for those that are involved in disputes and then the organisations that are delivering projects that potentially are in a dispute situation. So with output declining, construction output, that is, based on figures from February 2020 and 21, we've got 4.3% lower, and RICS adjudication referral data suggests an increase. I think historically, when you look at that data, as construction output declines, adjudication referrals tend to increase. So despite the 28-day procedure that the RICS offer, that could be a potential challenge in terms of improving productivity, and of course with dispute comes lots of other kind of disbenefits as well. Next slide please, Neil. Thank you very much. Okay, so some other useful data I think that we captured as part of the study. Firstly, the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions on the sector. So early in the pandemic, some sites did close, staff were furloughed, and then there was inevitable kind of issues around contractor cash flow as well. And I think when you speak to those that are involved in working on sites at lower tiers than tier 1, cash flow is a really kind of crucial issue. I actually have a builder working on a project for me at the moment at home, and he has about £80,000 of his own cash tied up in projects that he cannot complete because he cannot get building materials onto site. That creates huge levels of anxiety for him and for the staff that work for him, both directly employed or those that run the construction industry scheme. There's evidence potentially, although of cash hoarding at higher tiers, which could potentially strain supply chains and availability of trade credit insurance. So the kind of the general environment is quite difficult at the moment. In terms of revenue, productivity we think will continue to be lower until NPIs are lifted. But of course, recent investment decisions around the construction pipeline, that's the document published by the APA, which sets out the potential areas of investment in government expenditure and construction, may potentially improve the outlook as well. In terms of finance, again, this is a key concern for the industry in terms of its ability to bounce back and build resilience. You can see there's some quite large sums. Coronavirus business interruption loans are currently around 2.5 billion. Bounce back loans 7.5 billion, self-employment support 7.8 billion, and furlough 4.16 billion. This is for the construction sector itself. So there's some going to be interesting questions there about the impact that this has on tier 1 in terms of ability to borrow and renegotiation of new finance terms. And of course, insolvencies as well are predicted to rise as we kind of progress out of the pandemic and the various financial support mechanisms from the Treasury come to an end. But you do need to have the conversations with those that are working on the sites to appreciate how serious this is. And I think the one thing that I'd like to see the government perhaps recognise and focus their attention on is that many of our construction organisations at tier 2 and 3 are small, medium-sized enterprises, and the people that run that are entrepreneurs essentially. And the government has made it clear it's keen to support entrepreneurial skill and flair, and therefore this is a real priority, I think, in helping to support that particular part of the construction sector going forward. Next slide, please, Neil. So the kind of bringing together of all of the evidence that was gathered across the work packages, which Neil alluded to in his part of the presentation, has essentially been synthesized in 6 kind of key global themes that we think help really emphasize the dimensions of keeping the UK building safely in a post-COVID-19 pandemic world. I think in those previous slides I've emphasised the challenges around the context of the sector. We've talked over many years about the need for industry reform and to tackle its fragmented nature. The Transforming Infrastructure Programme, which is currently kind of taking place, industrial strategy and that kind of stuff. It's all there, but we still need to see genuine transformation, I think, particularly to support safe working cultures. Organisational culture is key. Of course, at Tier 1, the big organisations that we've engaged with have developed reasonably well articulated safety cultures, and one particular organisation that formed part of the study showed really strong evidence of mental health awareness, not just on building sites, but at the board level as well. But of course, as you pass down through the tiers, it can be much more kind of challenging to see evidence of that culture. Communication. And I think here, the key issue is actually about how risk is understood and framed and perceived by participants. Conversations that we've had suggest that decisions perhaps to isolate as a consequence of a positive test are more heavily influenced by the financial consequences of isolation, rather than perhaps the hazards associated with being exposed to COVID-19. I suppose it's much the same way that, to use an analogy, I used to have a motorbike and I enjoyed riding it, and I liked going fast on it, not breaking the speed limit, of course. You know, it was just a way of getting to work rather quickly. I tended to ignore, therefore, the hazards of using a motorbike, whereas my wife, who's a nurse, is completely against motorbikes because her experience of nursing and dealing with patients that have been in motorbike accidents tells her that she would much rather use alternative modes of transport. So kind of experiences do really shape our understanding and framing of risk. Best safety practice and technology use. So looking to balance the use of technologies with the practical realities of working on construction sites is a difficult challenge. Contractual partnerships, perhaps how new forms of contracts could emerge that place safety, health and well-being at the centre. So the new engineering contract, which has been in existence for a while now, is what we call project management centric, as opposed to engineer or architect led. But there is an opportunity, I feel, for contracts that place a significantly higher level of emphasis on a culture of good health, safety and welfare. And then finally, kind of multi-level challenges. And in multi-level challenges, we're talking about essentially the various tiers of the sector and how they interact with each other, and how vertical and horizontal supply chains work effectively. Next slide, please, Neil. We also spoke to construction division inspectors in the Health and Safety Executive and a representative from a construction trade union, just to vary the kind of the view that we were able to gather from the interviews and data collection with our Tier 1 contracting organisation participants. And of course, it was very kind of unique situation that health and safety inspectors found themselves in, having to kind of assess whether the arrangements on construction sites were consistent with what would be expected from a COVID-19 secure working environment. The industry was given pretty good guidance from the Construction Leadership Council through the site operating procedures, or the SOPs. but the evidence that we gathered suggested that there had to be a degree of interpretation in these rules to make them workable on construction sites. Sites are unique, they're generally delivering one-off projects, and therefore they're quite idiosyncratic, and therefore it's quite challenging actually to apply a generic set of guidance to specific projects. But what was quite interesting, what we did discover was that the imposition of social distancing on sites actually did have one benefit. Probably had a few benefits actually, but one that did kind of resonate quite well was the fact that it reduced the kind of conflicts around different trades working on site. So in a typical pre-pandemic world, you'd have electricians and joiners and other trades kind of jostling for space on site to get their packages completed. The imposition of social distancing actually required a bit more consideration about sequencing of construction works and when people could be on site and off site. So that's potentially brought some unexpected benefits there. But yeah, we'll definitely see a particular focus, I think, continuing on the use of face coverings until such time as government decides otherwise. Other things that came up: leadership and senior local level essential to set direction. So really this messaging needs to come from the top of the organisation. And site management skills as well, respect and support. So really, really important that construction managers take active leadership in this. And another CIOB are doing a lot of work on this at the moment, and in future work we're hoping to work with CIOB to reach out to tier 2 and 3 organisations to see how we may be able to support those organisations in maintaining the good practices that we've seen at tier 1. Okay, and finally, a respect for the threat of COVID-19. So I think the level of excess deaths here in the UK has started to kind of resonate with people, and therefore perhaps their perceptions around the hazards associated with COVID-19 have changed. Some practical things that we also observe through evidence gathered from the inspectors. So generally on sites, well-stocked hygiene facilities, so not necessarily just reliant on gels, but good general kind of welfare facilities. Staggered breaks, so things like this are pretty straightforward stuff, but actually in terms of being able to sequence a construction project, it does require quite a bit of effort to be able to think about how you stagger your workforce, how you make sure that that staggering reflects different sequences of work package activity, when materials are coming on site, what expertise you need at what different times. So not an easy thing to do. Coloured stickers on helmets to support bubbles was a good thing, quite a simple, low-cost initiative, but potentially really useful in reducing transmission on sites, and other things such as one-way systems and discs on canteen tables, site-specific risk assessments, etc. Neil? So some suggestions going forward. Do we need to think about more prescriptive rules and guidance, particularly in terms of moving out of the pandemic and preparedness for a future pandemic scenario? Consistent messaging. Clearly, the nature of the UK with devolved administrations and such forth may have led to a degree of confusion about what people can and can't do, particularly in organisations that are operating across different jurisdictions. Simple guidance on controls, so case studies specific to work type, site type, and these must be relevant and therefore simple to apply. And the need to communicate risk in a nuanced way. And certainly in the early part of the pandemic, the government's COVID-19 recovery strategy emphasised the importance of the communication of risk. But of course, individuals perceive risk in very different ways, and their perceptions are influenced by bias and experiences. So in order to communicate certainly hazards to workers on site and help them take risks in an appropriate way, we need to think about how we message and how we frame and use analogies to help people understand the the potential consequences of their decisions. Next slide, please, Neil. So in conclusion, we saw variations in reactions by contractors to the pandemic, which is to be expected. Certainly the organisations we engage with do quite a wide variety of different work, both government and commercial. And of course, the clients themselves are quite crucial here. Clients are CDM duty holders in much the same way that the principal contractor is. And we hope that clients have taken and shown leadership in maintaining a culture which promotes the importance of health, safety and welfare. There are new models of sponsorship that are being developed in government around construction projects. Highways England, for example, uses a different model to other government departments, and we're doing some really interesting work with the complex infrastructure programme at the moment to understand what that looks like. Varied approach to implementation of the CLC site operating procedures, which is no bad thing. I think it's good to see that contractors have felt confident in being able to take that guidance and then to tweak it and shape it for the unique nature of the projects that they're working on. And of course, that reflects different stages of the project life cycle as well. So if you're at the early stage of the project doing groundworks, open air environment, then the potential for aerosol transmission is perhaps much lower than it would be in a project which is very close to practical completion and therefore operatives working in an indoor environment more than outdoor. Adaptations to working have helped reduce COVID risks, but have faced challenges in their adoption. What we didn't see evidence of, which we were looking for, is whether there were challenges in communicating design changes between the principal designer and the principal contractor as a consequence of things like the need to practice social distancing. But we're going to do a bit more work around that going forward, hopefully, because it's a really important consideration, particularly in ensuring that the designers are engaged in discussions with contractors around how constructability has a potential impact on transmission. Over time, reduction in compliance and an increase in adverse impacts is affecting the industry effectiveness and wider safety. And with that, issues, as Neil mentioned, around mental health. A number of recent reports that have been published, the CIOB, the Association of Project Management, and the Institution of Civil Engineers have also highlighted the adverse effects that poor mental health potentially can have on the sector. And part of this, of course, is that the distribution of construction work around the UK is variable. So certain parts of the country have much more construction work and opportunity than others. So the workforce tends to find itself having to move around. That means using shared accommodations, shared transport, that kind of thing. And that can also lead to some challenges. So in summary, we are recommending a systems thinking-led approach to capture some of the social and legislative and political influences that may affect chains of transmission for preparedness in a post-pandemic world. I think that's it, Neil. Oh yes, a summary, a quote from one of our participants at the end, which we thought was quite a powerful one. COVID may have changed the world, but not the contract on this job. I thought that summarised the research really quite well. Okay, Neil, I think that's it from me.
Great, thanks, Rich. And so that's been a very fast run through what's been a tremendous piece of work to keep busy academics working together on this, along with HSC responding to the pandemic through government, and to keep them focused on this issue with all the other things going on has been a tremendous effort on everybody's part. Certainly a big thank you to everybody from myself, particularly to our core team, particularly Darren Clement and Helen Kreisel for keeping everybody in order, and for Vicky Turner to keep us up to all our deliverables and make sure that everything gets put into place contractually and so forth. So with that, I'll pass back to my co-director, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Neil and Richard. Really fascinating presentation. I think shows the importance of understanding the detail of specific parts of our economic system, because they will be major influencers on how those sectors respond to the pandemic. So that understanding becomes critical. We do have some questions, so I'll pass straight over to Ken Robertson to kick us off. Ken, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for the presentation, guys. I guess 2 points. One is, and it came up in the presentation, about the benefits of planning that came about as a consequence of COVID, which forced segregation of work parties and people to think about sequencing of work. And I just wondered if you could maybe expand a little bit on that and how transferable that learning is. And then the second point is also about learning, but it's cross-sector learning. So construction tends to be one of the poorer performing sectors with an improving trend. And there are other sectors that are worse, farming, a little bit of the recycling industry, and others that are better. What do you think coming out of this work can be taken for cross-learning, where construction can share learnings, the sector can share learnings with other sectors, and maybe some sectors that are performing better in a post-COVID world could share into construction? So impact of COVID in planning and cross-sector learning out of this work. If you can maybe have some comments on those, that would be great.
Would you like to take that, Neil? Okay. So I think for the first part, one of the lessons perhaps is realism around project schedule, and then the consequence that has for essentially the costing of projects. So the industry suffers, I think, with the consequences of a very aggressive kind of financial environment. So with the margins being so narrow, there's very little kind of scope and flexibility for contractors to make errors or to fall behind. So I think that the fact that social distancing and other MPIs have had an impact on how the industry operates have started to perhaps cast a light on the importance of being much more realistic about schedule. And certainly some of the other big government projects that have been criticised for being significantly delayed over time, over budget, may actually have been relatively successful, but just started out life with unrealistic and over-optimistic forecasts of costs and benefits. And you've got to be really careful about how you tell the public early in a project how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take, because once you give them a figure, a deterministic figure, they kind of stick that in the mind and think that that's what it's going to be. So that's one thing. To your second point about learning more generally, well, I think that the construction industry continues to suffer from fragmentation. Now, I recall many years ago attending an event where Sir Joe Dwyer, who's past president of the ICE, was talking about the paucity of investment in education and training in the construction sector, and the high levels of churn, people constantly moving to different projects and different organisations, acted as a disincentive to investing in people. And I think that hopefully now, as a consequence of the pandemic and potentially the impact that will have as a catalyst for industry reform, we'll start to see much greater levels of investment in education and training across the workforce. And that then, I hope, will help us to kind of think and learn more about what the industry needs to do to improve. I do often hear the statements around it, the industry is a poor performer, but actually there's a lot of really good stuff that goes on in terms of construction, some really impressive projects that are using very high levels of technology readiness. And if you think about Crossrail, putting a piece of tunnelling through central London is a hugely impressive achievement. Yes, it's significantly over time and over budget, but there's a huge amount to celebrate in terms of civil engineering there. So I think we do need to be mindful of the good stuff that does happen, and also perhaps, you know, reflect on how appropriate it is to compare practices in high value manufacturing versus the construction sector, which in my view operate in very, very different worlds. High value manufacturing, high levels of investment in education and training, reasonably well controlled physical environments in which they deliver their products. The industry in construction is fundamentally quite different, I would argue.
Thanks, Richard. Anything to add, Neil?
Well, I know Richard is such an expert and worked in the construction industry for such a long time that I wouldn't add anything to what he's just said. Further to emphasize the you know, the key result that came out for a non-construction scientist like me from all of this study was that whereas there was considerable input, a considerable focus and considerable impact on people's physical and mental health as a result of the pandemic, it was the financial impact that really came across as important to most of the workers at the coalface, and one that we need to address going forward.
Thanks, Neil. We've got another question from Elizabeth Cotton in the chat there, which is focusing on mental health interventions, particularly mental health interventions that don't compound existing vulnerabilities. That might relate to issues of disclosure and also to developing interventions that are prepared to access in this context because they need to be thinking, particularly with stakeholders such as trade unions and mental health networks, what the best approach might be. So have you given any thought through the work that you've done to the issue of mental health and how that could be improved in this particular sector?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly was a key part of what we did. And I know Marty Van Tommeren's on the call and worked closely with Sheena Johnson, who led that section. Marty, could you answer that?
Hi there. Thanks, Neil. I will try. I mean, I think it was obviously it's an important area of work and concern, especially going forward. I think given the kind of short period of time that we had and the fact that we were working as part of the, you know, within the protect context, i.e. that really is about you know, primarily about kind of looking at the transmissions of COVID-19 in the workplace. You know, we didn't spend a considerable amount of time to investigate the whole mental health angle of this. That doesn't mean to say that we don't believe that it's not important, and mental health interventions I think are incredibly important prior to, I mean, they were important prior to kind of COVID-19, and I think the need for these will only be emphasized have only been emphasized since the start of the pandemic and going back to some kind of normality. And I think it's something that, you know, in any kind of work going forward, we certainly will have to pay attention to.
Thanks, Marty. Any other questions or comments? Whilst people are thinking, just one from me. Clearly, you identified, Richard, at the end there some examples of good practice. Is that being widely shared across the industry? Clearly, if in particular organizations are doing good things and are using appropriate risk assessment approaches and the hierarchy of control to manage the potential for outbreaks to occur, for example, how is that being shared across the wider sector rather than just being limited to those particular organizations?
Well, I think the main conduit for sharing of this will be through the Construction Leadership Council, which kind of sets the tone really for this particular kind of issue, but I'd like to see the relevant professional institutions championing this as well. And I know that the Chartered Institute of Building are doing this. But I think also we need to think long term about the next generation of construction professionals and how we are encouraging them to think about these issues as well while they're currently at university. So in my world at Manchester, we on our civil engineering degree, we talk at length about design risk assessment. We teach the students about the importance of understanding hazards and how design introduces hazards in the construction, maintenance and operation phase. But we don't really have the conversations around mental health. These tend to be outside of the syllabus. So the ICE and the various other accrediting bodies kind of challenge us as institutions to encourage our students to be more kind of mindful of this, then I think we'll start to see positive change going forward. But I think it's also perhaps worth mentioning that the issues around poor mental health are not necessarily specific to construction. There's a much broader issue with mental health in the UK. In one example, we'll certainly see big issues around that in prisons as they come out of lockdown, and the lack of kind of registered mental health nurses and other mental health professionals as well. So if there's one thing I hope the pandemic will do, is it will cast a light on the importance of government investment in mental health services across our society and not just in the construction sector.
I think from my side as well, I mean, it's especially clear that the ability to have such a cross-subject, cross-profession basis within the Thomas Ashton Institute has given us a great role in being able to bring some of these problems to the fore and maybe make some of the messaging happen across boundaries that wouldn't have happened before. And that's something that I think an alliance like we've created can have a positive change, positive push for change in industries and sectors across the UK going forward.
Thanks, Neil. Time for one last question before we close. If anybody would like to either raise their hand or wave at me. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed to Neil and Richard. Really important piece of work, and I think shows how critical it is to understand the sort of economic systems underpinning some of our industrial sectors to be able to work out whether the national interventions that are being pushed forward at any particular time can be effectively implemented, and what the drivers within that system can be to prevent some of those appropriate actions from happening. The next lecture in our series will be on the 15th of June from 12:30 and will be delivered by Dr. Richard Thomas from DSTL, that's the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, and it's going to be on the contact transfer work that is being done at DSTL as part of the National Core Study. So there'll be a flyer goes out a little nearer the time, but please do find the time in your diary to attend. It'll be another fascinating insight into what we're doing under the National Core Study Programme, this time looking at some of those issues relating to how the virus might be transferred through contact. So thank you very much for your time. I hope it's been useful. We have recorded the session, so it will be available offline, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much indeed.